Just like climbing a mountain, thinking about UVs can be daunting, but it doesn't have to be. By the end of this video, you will never fear the process again. This video covers every major use case for UVs on game models. We're going to look at hero UVs, tileable UVs, and atlas and decal UVs, and as well how these should be applied to characters, environments, and props. But before we get into applications, this is a comprehensive video, so let's get into what UVs actually are. As you're most likely already aware, every point that makes up your 3D model has three coordinates, x, y, and z. For UVs, in order to apply textures to a model, we create two new coordinates, the u and v. While x, y, and z identify the location of points in 3D space, these u and v coordinates place each point on a flat grid. You can imagine a square that has 0 at the bottom left corner and 1 in the top right, and every one of your 3D points is plotted on a map. They're then connected with the same edges and faces that make up your 3D model. A 2D image can then be easily mapped from this flat projection onto all the surfaces of the 3D model. Now you understand what UVs are in a technical sense, let's get right into the more useful information. How do we make them? Through a process called unwrapping, we can create UVs. You may remember, at some point in your life, perhaps in early school, you were set the task to build a cube from a flat paper blueprint. Just in case you weren't, however, I'll show you an example here of roughly how it goes. When we're UV unwrapping though, we basically want to do the opposite of this. Instead of gluing edges together from a flat plane to create a 3D shape, we want to create a flat shape by cutting edges of a 3D shape apart. There's a few different ways to unwrap things and a few different reasons, so this video will be cut up into what use cases for each method is best. But before that, let's go over some terminology. I'm just going to go through all of the terms I will use in the video and give a quick definition. More detail will follow around the time of their first use in the video. A UV island, or an island, is a group of connected faces on the UV map. A seam is a cut between UV islands along an edge. The unwrap is the process of creating UVs from a 3D model. To pack is to optimize the amount of space that the UVs take up and fit them in as large as possible. A texture set is all of the islands that fit within one UV tile. And in Blender, this is a single material applied to it. A hard edge is an edge marked as sharp or creased on the model. Warping is the amount that the UV stretches when applied to the 3D model. And the texel density is a reference for how high resolution the UV map or each individual island is. Hero assets are a particular kind of model, usually an important prop, character, or weapon featured in a game. These assets use one or more unique texture sets. We're going to start off with hard surface weapons and props, and then cover characters later in the video. First of all, unless absolutely required, don't cut across the middle of a flat face. This is very likely to create obvious seams, and we want to hide them as much as possible. I'm going to use the texture grid in this section to display the effects of cutting in different places. When they're available, it's ideal to cut on hard edges. And just to clarify a few notes about shading and mesh normals. If you're not familiar with hard edges, essentially, on these edges, the smooth shading has been split. This will make it difficult to get a good quality normal bake if you bake over these hard edges. So as Confucius says, make sure every hard edge is a seam. But what about when you need seams and there's no hard edges? In these cases, look for smooth transitions between surfaces to place them on. The middle of bevels are ideal. If you create seams around areas that have mostly equal normals without hardening the edge, the baker will be able to handle it well later, and the normals are already mostly balanced around this area. It's a little difficult to gauge in certain circumstances the exact best placement of seams, and in these cases there's no shame in doing a few tests and making changes later. In the case of hero UVs, you want to create texture sets in such a way to be as optimized as possible for games. In this case, it means to reduce two things: draw calls and memory usage. If you create two texture sets, each at 1K resolution, this will use less memory than a single 2K texture set. However, the 2K texture set will still use less draw calls because it's only pulling one texture instead of two. This information is too far from UVs to have time to fully explore in this video, but in the case of both, less is better, just as long as the visual standard can be maintained and everything can be kept within the performance budget. So for this section, I'm going to go through unwrapping this low poly piece live to illustrate some of the decision making techniques based on the information we've gone over so far. So this is the hard surface piece I'm going to unwrap, and all I need to do is, to start off with, is mark the normals to auto smooth and type in a really high number like 180 or 120, and then just shade the mesh smooth. And then from here on out, I just need to go to every hard edge and work my way around, selecting them all. Let's come in here just very carefully to make sure I select the right ones. This triangulated area here makes it a little bit more difficult to select. But I can just go through carefully to make sure nothing goes wrong. There we go. And then all I do is do Control E and do Mark Sharp. And you see that's already sorted out the shading for this part. All I'm going to do is work my way around the gun. Ignore that. We'll get back to that in a minute. Work my way around this piece of the gun and just look at where the right areas are to make sharp and make them so. So all I'm looking for is big harsh angled corners pretty much. Those are the prime targets for marking sharp. Now, what I would normally utilize in the situation, what I will utilize in a minute, is the add-on hard ops. You can buy it for a couple dollars. Well, not a couple dollars. It's like, I think it's $30 at the very most. It'll set you back a little bit of money, but it will set you forward an enormous amount of time. Because what it does is, it allows us to automate the sharpening process. You can see, I'm going around here very slowly, clicking through everything like this. But instead of doing that, I can just mark these sharps, you know, it takes forever. Instead, I can just do one command. I can just click S mark like that, and it will automatically calculate which edges should be sharp based on that angle. Now, this isn't perfect, but it's pretty damn good. So we're going to use this as a base. Otherwise, you just need to go around and mark them all sharp manually, but I strongly encourage you to purchase and use hard ops for stuff like this. It's worth every single penny. Now, what I'm looking for at this point is hard edges that are not correct. Like here, we need a hard edge there. Sometimes it misses hard edges, and sometimes it adds hard edges where there shouldn't be any. Another two got missed there because the angle was too shallow. Another one missed here. Again, the angle too shallow. And here too. There's one where it's marked it, but the angle's too steep. You shouldn't have marked that one. And there as well. That was one of my mistakes when I was marking them normally. So I'm just looking around here some more where it's slipped and it's not marked them as hard. And really what I'm looking for is just to create the shading to be as close to exactly perfect as possible. And that way the normal map will have to do way less work. Alright. That's the shading sorted out. Just about anyway. Let's do the seams. The first step in seams is just to select every sharp edge just by clicking on one of them, doing Shift G, clicking sharpness to select all the same sharpness edges, and then doing Control E and marking seams. That's a great start. Now, I will notice again there's another one missing here. And it is just a process of slowly working through the mesh, edge by edge, and just ensuring that every seam has been correctly marked. This mesh has been triangulated because I worked it into a game engine or into ZBrush, but you don't need to probably have such a rough mesh yourself. You'll have a bit of an easier time of it. Gotta remove that one. And this one here. And there's one missing up there. Let's mark that. Well, all I'm doing is just looking for angles like this. Angles like that are the best place to mark. You know, think about where do you have your bevels. That's where you want to mark seams like this. There's the missing one there. Nice. So it looks like I've got just about everything. And let's look at marking some seams to cut around some of these other areas. So if you remember, when we're going to want to cut this side here, basically, off the other side. So if you remember, on these parts here, as I discussed earlier, we just want to cut around like this. And we want to cut pretty much as close to the middle of the big bevel as we can. That's nice. Same idea goes here on this trigger guard. Let's just put one cut at the front and one cut at the back, basically right in the middle of these big bevels. And we don't mark these as sharp. We just mark these as seams. This piece here is okay, I think. We don't need to mark a cut on that. We do need to mark some cuts on these cuts through the trigger magazine well though. So let's just again pick right in the middle of the bevels just to cut there. And again, no sharp needed, we're just going to cut straight through with the Themes. I have them symmetric on both sides. There we go. Over to here. And what we don't want is we don't want loops that connect themselves all the way around, because that will cause a problem. If this loop doesn't have any cuts on it and it's all around like that, it will stretch a lot. So you always want to put at least one cut in any circular loop of topology. Nice. It looks like I put just about every seam on here necessary. Let's try an unwrap. You weren't meant to see that, but that was one I prepared earlier. Let's do another unwrap to see. Now, at this point, I started to get a bit ahead of myself and into the packing of the UVs. But don't worry, we'll come back to that shortly. But first, let's just have a little look at a bit more theory. Now we've cut all our islands out and we're ready to move on. However, they need to be packed. Let's look at the considerations we need to make. First of all, scale. It's important to make sure that every UV island is scaled correctly, or we're at least in control and aware of how they're scaled unevenly and are doing it as an intentional effect to save UV space on the unseen faces. In Blender, it's easy to confirm we're scaling everything correctly. Just select all your objects, apply their 3D scale, and then activate the UV function to average the island scale. Now, our next consideration is pixel grid alignment. We're of course going to apply an image texture to this mesh, and we want to have it apply as well as possible. If pixels on an image come at a seam from an angle other than 90 degrees, it can sometimes present a less than ideal visual. Of course, every 3D model isn't made of squares, so this is unavoidable. But in the UV game, just like many other things, it's about minimization of error instead of agonizing over perfection. To achieve this, just make sure your island sits straight on the grid and don't rotate long edges of pieces to odd angles. The last consideration we want to make for our UV layout, before checking for overlap anyway, is that of map spacing. Game engines, in order to retain high performance, reduce the texture resolution of faraway objects by a power of 2, basically halving it if you're not into the lingo just yet. This means that if two UV islands are very close together, when this operation takes place, the textures will begin to bleed between the two islands. There's an absolute wealth of information about this topic available on this Polycount page, linked in the description. But, to summarise, the key points is this. There's a set ratio of spacing we should use, and the UVs will be scaled uniformly by it. So if we have a 1K map, it will scale perfectly up to a 2, 4 or 8K map, as long as the UVs have that spacing set correctly in the first place. According to Polycount, for a 1K texture that's 1024 pixels by 1024 pixels, there needs to be 8 pixels between the islands. And we're going to use an add-on to get this result, a free one, so no complaints there. The website link is in the description, and it has all the instructions on how to install there. Now we have it all set up and configured, the add-on, let's follow the instructions from Polycount and introduce a 8 pixel gap to the 1K texture. What I'm going to do first is go over and ensure that I've rotated all these islands correctly, just to go along with what we were saying before. Just a couple of things to straighten out here. Now everything here looks just about in order. Let's set up the packer. All we need to do is turn off pre-rotate so it doesn't rotate things away from our 90-degree angle we want. Let's set the padding to 8 pixels because as you can see it's already by default set itself to 1K. And then we just click pack. And that's already a pretty good layout, utilising 59% of the UV sheet, which is a good percentage. Let's click pack a few more times just to increase the optimization. 59.94, nearly 60%. 60% would be a really good target, and this is close enough, so I'm pretty happy with this pack. Let's check we got everything right. The easiest way to check your UVs are functional is to run the Blender overlap check. This will tell us if any islands are on top of each other, and should they be on top of each other, this will cause baking and texturing errors later on. For the sake of example, I will create a situation here where we have an issue with an overlap to fix. In these situations, we may need to add more seams to fix the problem, or we may just need to move islands around if the UV pack is unsatisfactory. Let's run through the two problems that we're likely to encounter while doing UV unwraps, and fix them. So in this situation, I've created a specialized shape here that will cause the UV problem we're trying to fix. Let's turn the shadows on the cavity map so you can see a little easier the shape of this. What it is we have two faces like this parallel to each other. So when I do an unwrap on this, you can see we get a pretty flat square unwrap, which would be fine, except here there are two overlapping faces. We can see if we do a select overlap from earlier, this area all registers. Now what we need to do in this case is break the one rule that I said earlier about not putting a seam on a flat face. So these two edges here need to be seamed up. And then when you unwrap it, these will be put as separate islands, and you can see we won't have any issues with overlap. That's the way to fix the first issue that we may encounter while doing UV unwraps, especially with hard surface pieces. But this can also occur on characters under more organic circumstances, like clothing. Is a common place for this sort of issue to occur. This one will show us the second issue, and it may not be immediately obvious, but should I select overlap, we'll see this will select the center of the area here. And what this is just when the islands have been packed or when they've been unwrapped, they've been on top of each other. And this is the easiest issue to fix in the world because all you need to do is just grab the island that's overlapping and just move it away. Easy as pie. Now, let's move on to how to do UVs for the most common kind of hero asset, characters. But before we get into that, a big thanks to Jack for lending this model for use in the video. He makes awesome art and you should definitely go and check out his Artstation. Link is, as with many other links in this video, in the description. Anyway, let's start with heads. We want to reduce warping, mostly around the face, and we certainly don't want a seam there. So in the case of heads, it's best to put a seam from the top of the head, or above the forehead, down to the back of the base of the neck. This will unwrap and give a fairly flat projection for most of the head. Another method would be to cut the face out on its own island if we want an especially high level of detail. I've personally seen this utilised mostly in cinematics more than games, but UVs are leaning into a kind of experimental place at the moment as far as I can see. There's also looking at unwrapping hands and arms. In the case of hands, we want to usually slice them in half around the outside and then also cut around the wrist. The lower or an upper arm, however, will usually suffice to have only a single cut running all the way up, and then one cut around the wrist and the shoulder. That'll put them in one neat island. In the case of this particular character, it has some more complex shapes to the clothes, and I'm going to work through those live and talk about the process. So we have the hands and arms and the head unwrapped, as I said before. Let's go through and unwrap the rest of these clothes. First of all, I'm just going to do a cut around the shoulders. That's very standard. And then I'm going to cut up to the edge of this big collar here. Now Jack's model's really great for this particular thing because the UVs are, sorry, the shape of the mesh is very unorthodox. So the UVs in their own way have to hit certain criteria we wouldn't normally be tackling. Like, look at this, it's a little bit of a difficult situation here, so I'm just going to cross over this edge. And I'm trying to trace the big standout edges as we discussed before. I'm going to take it around the inside of this actually. As we discussed before in the hard surface section, this is kind of like halfway between the two. Now I'm going to actually join these two together because you can make these kind of small changes when you're doing your UVs to the topology. And it'll get you a better bake in the end because you're controlling the way that the mesh is going to be triangulated. So then I can just follow around this lower edge again. So keybinds wise, I'm really not using very much. I'm just using standard selections, pressing J to join the faces together, and then pressing Ctrl E to mark the seams. There's not too much to learn in that regard. I'm going to take a seam down the front here, lead it to this edge. So in theory, once I can tackle this belt section here, I'm actually going to cut along there. It's not the ideal place to cut, but definitely is overlap if we don't cut there. So I'm going to add a checker texture to the model. This is much more difficult and involved to unwrap than the previous one for that small piece of the rifle or a submachine gun. So you can see if I unwrap now, we actually don't do too badly for this long coat already, just with what we have. And we can use a similar technique on these upper sleeves here. Let's check them out. What I'm going to try and do is cut off the extremely large parts here at the base. Actually, not at the base. I'm just going to bring them, well, at the base and at the top. Cut them like that. I'll cut them around the bottom. And then as we're going to seam up the arm, let's run it on the underarm actually, it'll be less obvious. Let's think about seams in this situation. So you can run them really over any surface because it's all going to be smooth. But you want to keep them out of the way as much as possible. Alright, let's cut in here again. We have to do both sides because this particular model is asymmetrical, but if you have a symmetrical model, you can just mirror it. Let's see. That's not too bad, but let's give a cut around the back of these guys so that it unwraps as a full long string. Here we go, they're unwrapping in a pretty desirable way now. With these kind of clothes, it's very difficult, very challenging, almost impossible to get them to correctly line up with the pixel grid that we talked about earlier in the video, so you just have to do your best. I'm going to cut around the bottom of this collar here because there's too much warping. These kind of decisions, it's hard to explain why you make them. Like, the more you practice, the more you do, you'll just start to pick up these things, which is, you know, not the most helpful thing for a tutorial to say. It's just practice more, man, come on. But seriously, like, you will get good at just knowing where the right place is for seams. Like, I've just realized along here I need to cut between this section. Just want to join there. You see, sometimes I have to break the rules, and this is cutting across what's pretty much a flat face. It's also very hidden. You can see now this long coat, with the cuts I've made, with like just this piece here, you can see I'm only keeping the parts that are mostly like square and flat with each other. So when this unwraps, it will unwrap mostly like in a square kind of outline grid. But yeah, there's some things like you really can only learn them just by feeling your way through it. But I'll give you as much information about the rules as possible. But really, like, you can see I'm doing the same thing as hard surface. I'm just aiming for edges, and I'm just trying to do what you're talking about at the beginning, but like cutting out the box, you know, turning this 3D shape into a flat shape. Let's analyze this piece of topology here. And I didn't actually look at this mesh before either. This isn't a here's one I prepared earlier situation. I'm just looking here. You know, a rule of thumb, like, we have a 90-degree angle coming along the inside here. This is definitely somewhere to cut. In fact, it's probably even somewhere to mark sharp, so I'm going to do just that. Select all these. And then I'm going to use hard ops again to mark, because hard ops is an absolute, just such a good asset for this kind of thing. You can see now the shading cuts off here. Let's go along the inside and do that. Now, the game this model was designed for had quite a long way away the camera. Some of these areas are a little bit unconventional, a little bit hidden, but they can still be UV just like everything else. Now I just marked just hard edge along here because this belt is like a separate part to the shirt underneath. So adding a sharp there should increase the quality of the bake, in theory. Let's go around the outside of this brooch as well. I got pretty lucky with that selection there. Just mark that as a seam, and let's harden it as well. I don't think we need to harden the corners, so we should mark them. Let's check this out. We're going to need another hard seam here. But actually, let's move it one to the right. A little bit of technically challenging place here. Some of this topology. It's quite nice. So there we go. That belt now, it's a lot flatter on the front here. You see this is going to bake on the normals way better because these flat faces I've flattened. Now let's just see about adding some seams around this here. I know I was just imagining, like, if this was a real thing and I had some scissors, how would I cut this out, you know? Let's just mark this up. There we go. And like, see this is some intensely warped normal shading here, so I'm going to mark seams around, mark sharps around here, so that it renders a lot more flat, and it'll bake a lot better. There you go. See, for some things it's fine, like there's only a little bit of warping there, but you see on that other piece it was extreme normal warping. So these UVs, let's check them out, because they're actually looking pretty good. Oops. Images in this PC, you see this side stretched right out, but this side's like condensed off, so I'm just curious what's happening here. And this is a big part of UVs as well, it's just identifying which pieces go across each mesh. If you see this thing up here, the selection option, you can choose between selecting what's having to select everything here, and then the selections being their own individual thing on this window, or so that both are synced. So select something here, it'll select on the UV grid, and they're different at different times. Now, I thought this may be an issue with the sleeve, but it turns out it's just the front of the body. So everything's fine with these UVs. Let's pack them. Check for overlap. Now we have a little bit of overlap going on. Let's check out what's happening. Yeah, so see here, this piece here, this unwrap, has folded kind of over on itself. This part's come around a corner, and this face are overlapping. So all I can do is just simply grab that little vertex there and just move it up another way, and then there won't be any overlap there anymore. And the last piece of overlap's down here. Now this looks like there's a missing UV seam here. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said sometimes there needs to be another seam. So let's check out this location. Yeah, so you can see this is the end of the cufflink thing, and I forgot to sharpen and add a seam there, probably because it didn't get caught in the loop selection. So I can select this part down here inside the wrist again, and then I can unwrap it, scale the islands, as we talked about before, get that consistent textile density, and then pack them. Pack them with 8. Check for overlap, and there we go, that's it. I mean, that's complete UVs. That easy. You just gotta follow the rules, and you just gotta drill it over and over again, and you will get quick, and you will get it done. Let's move on to the next segment. Environment UVs, in contrast to character or hero UVs, repeat their textures over and over again in order to cover as much space in the scene as possible. They use tiling UVs, atlas or decal UVs, trim sheets, and other techniques to get as much as possible out of a single texture set. It's worth noting as well that you can use, if the prop is important enough, regular hero UVs. In contrast to hero UVs, where the UV comes first and the textures come second, in this case the texture comes first. These techniques, largely used for environment art, focus on repeating a texture over a UV area many times. In these cases, we don't need to have any concern for overlap or exceeding the bounds of the UV area. These techniques are often used to create floors, walls, and other parts of buildings or man-made structures. Here's an example of unwrapping a wall to fit on a tiling texture. We want to unwrap each large face without any cuts that we might make if we were using hero UVs. Following on from that, we want to match our texture as best we can to the piece, lining up the edges of the texture with the mesh. If you need to source some textures to practice this with, or to use on projects, textures.com is an excellent free resource that I use to source the ones for this video. Tiling textures can be experimented with quite well, however they have a downside of being very repetitive. When using these in projects over large surfaces, consider some ideas to break up repetition, such as pieces of geometry or mixed materials using vertex paint. Atlas UVs, also known as decal sheets, are a method of creating geometry stamps. Similar to tiling textures, we start with the texture before we move on to the UVs. A typical Atlas UV looks like a sheet with several images on it. These may be decals to add to surfaces, plant foliage, or numerous other things. There are many uses for this type of UV in environment and even character art. In characters, it's quite common to utilize Atlas UVs like this for hair cards to add hair to the character. The advantage of this is being able to fit several different images onto one texture and to use that efficiently in engine. One such use would be to add decals onto a hard surface piece or to place them in engine in a scene. Another use is for creating foliage, with a reasonable amount of variety sourced from a single texture map. A trim sheet in function sits somewhere between an Atlas UV and a tiling texture. Typically, they're baked from geometry and tie along only one axis of the UV grid. This can then be used to run along certain strips of geometry. These trim sheets are more popular with man-made structures as the technique matches well to rows of bricks or strips of metal. To apply a trim sheet to your model, all you need to do is unwrap in strips and ensure your strip matches the width of the UV grid. Then, you can match the top and bottom line of the strip to which part of the trim sheet you intend to use. In the case of environment art, if we want to bake our lighting or create ambient occlusion maps for our models, we need to utilize a second UV channel. These can be created and then assigned to the Lightmap or ambient occlusion in-engine. To create a second UV channel like this, it's actually very easy. Just add a new channel and then do hero style unwrap on the model. Or, alternatively, in this situation, as these UVs aren't used for regular textures, it's acceptable to use one of the automated solutions to unwrap the model. That's just about everything I can possibly think to cover about UV unwrapping. If there's any unanswered questions though, hit me up with them in the comments. They'll be answered there, or if they're more complex, I'll do a full follow-up video. This video will be timestamped to allow for easy revisiting, because as nice as it would be to make a video that upon a single viewing gives you perfect UV skills, it is sadly not possible. But practice some and revisit topics, and check out the links to stuff like the Polycount Wiki and the HardOps add-on, and you'll be a UV master before you even realise. If this video helped you out with anything, please do send it to a friend who wants to up their UV skills, or like the video to help get it out to more people. And if you'd like to see more, subscribe to the channel for a new video every month.